The first step to completing your plushie is creating your plushie pattern. This is the simple sample pattern that you will be given. It's of a teddy bear. You do not need to make your plushie into a teddy bear. You can make your plushie however you want, but you will be using this basic pattern in order to do it. I suggest using this basic pattern for your first plushie. As you get more experienced in plushie making, you can experiment with other patterns or creating your own. But this is the one we're going to use for this time because it's simple and easy to use. A couple of things to point out about your plushie. This pattern has two lines around the outside of the bear, a dotted line and a solid line. The solid line shows the outside of what will be your fabric piece. The dotted line is your stitch line. The space between the dotted and solid lines is known as your seam allowance. This is the distance between your stitch line and the edge of your fabric. Please note that while designing your plushie, anything on the outside of that dotted line, so anything that falls between the dotted and the solid line, will not be visible in your final plushie. If you do want to change this pattern in order to make your plushie a person or a rabbit or anything like that, you can do so by adding, subtracting, or moving different elements of the plushie. For this first step, please draw on all elements of the plushie, including eyes, noses, clothes, designs, and anything else. You want this to look like your final plushie will look. Here is how I altered the plushie pattern to make a Highland cow plushie pattern. You can see I kept the body relatively the same, but I added black hooves on the feet and arms. I also added little details like a nose and a chin and fur to the front part of the neck and the back part of the head. I did alter the pattern somewhat. I moved the ears and changed their shape to give him big floppy ears on the side of his head. I also chose where I was going to put the eyes and add eyelids. You'll notice that I have drawn in here very lightly with a dotted line where I'm going to put horns. Now I've done this with a dotted line because this isn't going to be part of the plushie outline that I cut out, but rather I'm going to add them later once the plushie is sewn together. I just wanted to see how it was going to look overall. Something else that you'll notice is that when I was doing the ears, I went ahead and added seam allowance around the ears. Our seam allowance is there to account for the fabric that's going to be tucked into the inside of our plushie and not seen. So I drew the original ears, which you can see on the back pattern. I didn't add the seam allowance yet. It's just his ears drawn. But on the front part of the pattern, we have this extra bit of space around the ears themselves, which attach to the head. This is my new seam allowance. Anything that you have coming off of your plushie, like ears or other arms or anything else, is going to need seam allowance. If you don't include the seam allowance, then that part of your plushie is going to come out much, much smaller than you originally intended. You can see that I've also planned out on my plushie design the colors I'm going to use and where I'm going to place them. I've also planned out what stitches I'm going to use to put my plushie together. Step 2 for creating your plushie is to transfer all those design elements that you added to your original plushie design onto another piece of paper to use as pattern pieces. You do this by tracing from your original drawing. Now remember, when you're tracing, be as precise as possible. These paper pattern pieces are going to be laid on your fabric, traced around, and cut out to create your fabric pattern pieces. So they need to look how you want your actual fabric pattern pieces to look. You'll notice that I've written on each one of these pattern pieces. The first thing that I've written is the name of the pattern piece. For example, front hair, ear, chest fur, right foot, etc. The second thing that I've noted down is what color of felt I'm going to use for each pattern piece. Tan, pink, black, white, brown, etc. The third thing that I've noted is how many of these pattern pieces I need to cut out of that fabric. For example, in the upper right corner, you can see that there is an ear piece. It's going to be cut out of pink fabric, and I need to cut 2. That's because there are 2 ears, and I want them to match. So if I cut 2 of these pieces, they will. Something to note while you're cutting out your pieces from the fabric is that if you are going to cut 2 pieces, you need to flip your paper pattern piece over so that you have a mirrored image of that pattern piece for your second fabric piece. Some fabrics this matters and some it doesn't, but it's always good to practice proper cutting technique. You'll also notice that each of these pattern pieces has a tiny little MB on it. That's because MB is my initials. That way, if anyone finds my pattern pieces, they'll know who to give them back to. I would like to direct your attention to the bottom and bottom right corner of this image. You'll see 2 pattern pieces that look a little different from the other ones, the tail and the horns. These are going to be 3-dimensional, meaning they come up off my original pattern. I'm going to need to sew 2 of them together and then fill them with stuffing to make them 3-dimensional. And because of the way I'm sewing them together, I need to add seam allowance. Remember, any part of your plushie that you want to be 3-dimensional and come off the main body of your plushie will need to have seam allowance added. This fabric, the seam allowance, will not be visible in your final plushie. So make sure that any detail that you add to these pieces are within the visible portion of the fabric and not just in the seam allowance. Thank you for joining me on steps 1 and 2 of building your own plushie. I hope this video has been informative and that you join me next time for the following steps in making your new friend. Bye!